It was one of those days in early summer when the heat hadn't quite reached its oppressive peak, but the air was thick with the promise of what was to come. I was 15, maybe 16 at the time, and I remember that lazy, sweltering afternoon vividly because it was when the bizarre happened. We'd just finished lunch, some overcooked hot dogs on the grill as my dad wasn't much of a cook, and as was typical for our small suburban family, we decided to stretch our legs in the backyard before retreating into the air-conditioned bliss of the house. Now, I should preface this by saying our backyard wasn't anything special. A patch of browning grass, a few scattered flower beds my mom never really got around to tending, and our swimming pool, an above-ground model that had been in the family since before I was born. But it was ours, and it was where I spent most of my summer days back then. As we stepped out that day, my dad froze halfway down the back steps. "What the hell?" he muttered, squinting in the direction of the pool. My mom followed his gaze, then let out a soft gasp. I pushed past them, my curiosity instantly piqued, and there they were. Crawfish, dozens of them, just floating. Not dead, but very much alive, scuttling around the bottom of our pool like they owned the place. At first, we just stood there in stunned silence. It was so completely out of left field that our brains couldn't process what we were seeing. We didn't live anywhere near a river or a lake, and the last time I checked, crawfish weren't the type of animal that just decided to pop in for a swim. But there they were. These weird little creatures, like something out of a low-budget sci-fi movie. "Did you do this?" my dad finally asked, turning to me with an accusatory look. I was the kind of kid who loved a good prank, and I could tell he thought this was one of mine. "I swear I didn't," I replied, genuinely baffled. We spent the next half hour speculating. Maybe some neighbor kids had tossed them over the fence as a joke. Maybe they'd come up through the drainage ditch that ran behind our house after a storm, though we hadn't had rain in days. Every theory we came up with sounded more ridiculous than the last, but none of us had a better explanation. And with no answer in sight, my dad, ever the pragmatist, fetched a net and started scooping them out one by one. We never did figure out where they came from. Crawfish invasion became one of those strange family stories we'd pull out at Thanksgiving or Christmas to laugh about when the conversation started to lag. I remember one year, my Uncle Jim swore they were some kind of alien reconnaissance mission sent to scout Earth's water supplies. It was all nonsense, of course, but it was our nonsense, and we leaned into it. But what I didn't know then, what none of us knew, was that this weird little event would come to mean so much more to me later in life. Back then, it was just one of those strange, unexplainable things you forget about once life starts moving on, and life did move on fast. By 2018, I was a very different person. Life had a way of wearing me down in ways I hadn't anticipated. I'd lost friends, made mistakes, carried regrets. But the hardest blow came when I lost my best friend. His name was Ryan, and we had been inseparable since we were kids. He was the kind of friend you could count on, the kind who stuck by your side through all the highs and lows of teenage years. We'd grown up together in that same sleepy suburban neighborhood, playing video games in each other's basements, sneaking out late at night to drive aimlessly through the town just for the hell of it. And now he was gone. The thing about Ryan's death was that it wasn't a surprise, not really. He'd been sick for a long time, and we'd all known the day was coming. But knowing something and being ready for it are two very different things. When he passed, it felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. There was this void where he used to be, and I didn't know how to fill it. His family never really did much in the way of a funeral. Ryan had always been a bit of an outsider, even within his own family. His parents were distant, almost cold. And when the time came, they didn't seem to know how to properly say goodbye to their son. They held a small service at a local funeral home, but it was impersonal, just a few people milling around awkwardly, making small talk about what a tragedy it was. That wasn't how I wanted to remember him. Ryan had been larger than life, full of energy and humor, and I couldn't bear the thought of him being forgotten in such a hollow, quiet way. So, I decided to do something about it. A few months after his passing, I organized a small memorial of my own. It wasn't anything elaborate, just me and a few close friends who had known Ryan well. We gathered at his favorite park, a spot we'd spent hours in during our teenage years. There was this old oak tree there, massive and gnarled, with roots that jutted out of the ground like crooked fingers. We used to sit beneath it, talking about everything and nothing, dreaming about the future in that naive way teenagers do. I had a plaque made in his memory. It wasn't big, Just a small metal plate with his name on it and a simple inscription, "Forever a part of this place." I mounted it at the base of the oak tree, beneath the canopy that had once sheltered our teenage dreams. Standing there, staring at that plaque, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't closure. Not exact. I'm not sure you ever really get closure when you lose someone like that, but it was a step toward accepting the loss. Ryan was gone. But this park, this tree, this place we'd loved so much would always remind me of him. Funny how life connects things in ways you don't expect. I thought back to that summer day with the crawfish, and suddenly it didn't seem so random. Maybe it was just one of those inexplicable quirks of life. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was a reminder of the weirdness, the unpredictability, the humor and the absurd. Ryan would have loved it. And in that moment, standing beneath that tree, I laughed. The memorial had started in that strange, quiet way that gatherings like that do. There's always this unspoken tension, a balance between grief and celebration, where people aren't quite sure whether they should smile or keep a solemn expression. I think everyone came with a mixture of emotions that day, unsure of what to say, but knowing they needed to be there, just as I had. The plaque had been placed at the base of the oak tree, and we all sat in a loose circle around it. It was an odd sight. All of us there. People I hadn't seen in years, some I only vaguely remembered from high school. But Ryan had a way of connecting. He was the kind of person who could float between different friend groups without ever feeling out of place. You didn't forget a guy like that. The stories started coming slowly at first. People shared the usual safe memories, funny things he'd said in class, embarrassing moments we'd had at parties. The time he'd tried to ride a skateboard down the steepest hill in town and ended up with his leg in a cast for half the summer. It was all light-hearted, the kind of stuff you say when you're trying to avoid the deeper, more painful memories. Then, one of the girls who had been in Ryan's circle, her name was Claire, if I remember right, stood up. She was quiet for a moment, almost as if she wasn't sure whether to share what was on her mind. Then, with a small smile, she started talking about a prank Ryan had pulled years ago. "You know," she began, "there was this one time when Ryan was determined to prank someone. It was one of those classic Ryan ideas that didn't really make sense, but seemed hilarious to him at the time." Everyone chuckled. We all knew that side of him, the side that would latch onto the most absurd idea and see it through just for the sheer joy. Ryan wasn't someone who pranked for malice or to embarrass someone. He did it because he loved making people laugh. He had somehow gotten his hands on a bunch of crawfish, she continued, shaking her head at the memory. And I have no idea how or why, but I remember him sneaking around late at night, and I asked him what he was up to. He grinned that stupid grin of his and said, "I'm going to give someone a surprise in their pool." A wave of laughter rolled through the group, that warm, cathartic kind of laughter that happens when you're remembering something ridiculous someone you loved did. Even I laughed, though my mind was elsewhere, drifting back to that strange day years ago when I had walked out into my backyard and found those crawfish floating in our pool. The memory was faint, but it was there, tucked away in the back of my mind like a dusty old book you hadn't looked at in years. But then my mom, who had come with me to the memorial for support, leaned over and whispered, "Hold on a minute." She looked at me with wide eyes, and I could see the wheels turning in her head. At first, I didn't get it. I just smiled and nodded, thinking she was getting caught up in the nostalgia of it all. But then it hit me too. Like a slow wave, the pieces started to come together. "Wait," I muttered under my breath, barely believing the connection my brain was making. I glanced over at my mom, and she had this look on her face, somewhere between disbelief and amusement. She was thinking the same thing I was. Could it have been? Could Ryan have been the one responsible for that bizarre crawfish incident all those years ago? "Was it our pool?" my mom whispered almost to herself. I laughed, but it was a nervous, incredulous laugh. I hadn't thought about that day in years, but now, hearing Claire's story, it all seemed to make a weird kind of sense. Ryan. It was Ryan. Of course it was. Who else could have come up with such a strange, ridiculous prank? Claire kept talking, but I wasn't really listening anymore. My mind was spinning with the realization that one of the strangest, most inexplicable moments of my teenage years might have just been solved at this memorial. It felt surreal, like I'd accidentally opened a door to the past and found this little piece of him waiting for me. After Claire finished her story, I couldn't help myself. I had to ask, "Do you remember whose pool it was?" I asked her, trying to keep my voice casual, though I could feel the excitement bubbling beneath the surface. She looked at me, puzzled for a second, then shook her head. No, I don't think he ever said. He just thought it would be funny to see someone's reaction when they found a bunch of crawfish in their pool. I glanced over at my mom again, and she was grinning now, fully on board with the idea. It wasn't hard to imagine Ryan sneaking into our backyard in the dead of night, laughing to himself as he dumped the crawfish into our pool. It was exactly the kind of thing he would have done, just to get a laugh out of it later when he heard us tell the story. I think it might have been our pool, I said, the words coming out slowly as if saying them made the whole thing even more ridiculous. Claire's eyes widened and she let out a surprised laugh. No way! I nodded, and suddenly everyone at the memorial was laughing again, the mood shifting back to that light-hearted space where grief and joy seemed to coexist. It felt right, like Ryan was still there with us, pulling pranks from beyond the grave, making sure we didn't take ourselves too seriously. For a moment, we weren't just remembering Ryan. We were living with him again, sharing a moment that felt like it had come straight from one of those absurd adventures we used to have when we were younger. The connection between the past and the present had never felt so strong. It was like the universe had handed me this strange little gift, tying up a loose end I didn't even know I needed closure. And as the laughter died down, I realized that this was exactly what Ryan would have wanted. Not the solemn, impersonal service his family had thrown together, but this, his friends gathered around a tree, laughing at the ridiculous things he'd done, remembering him not just for his death, but for his life. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I went to bed with a smile on my face, picturing Ryan sneaking through our backyard all those years ago, his arms full of crawfish, grinning from ear to ear. It was such a Ryan thing to do, and in a way, it felt like he was still around, making sure we didn't forget how to laugh, even in the hardest moments. And maybe, just maybe, that was his final prank. One last laugh for the road. And that's when it hit us both. The crawfish in our pool all those years ago? That was him. My best friend, Ryan, had been the mastermind behind the whole thing. We sat there, stunned for a second, the weight of the realization settling in. Then, without any warning, both my mom and I just burst out laughing. I don't know if it was the relief of finally solving the mystery, or the sheer ridiculousness of it all, but we couldn't stop. For over a decade, my family had wondered about those crawfish. We had built this whole narrative around it being some random prank by neighborhood kids, maybe even blamed it on some natural phenomenon we didn't understand. But no, it was Ryan. Of course it was. That little prankster had been laughing at us this whole time, and we had no idea. As the laughter died down, I found myself torn between being completely amused and, well, just a little bit offended. Who pranks their best friend like that? Who takes the time and effort to collect crawfish, sneak into someone's backyard, and toss them into a pool, knowing it's going to confuse the hell out of them? But then again, this was Ryan we were talking. If anyone was going to pull off something that absurd, it was him. He was always a little wild, always doing something outrageous just to see what would happen. It wasn't about causing trouble for the sake of it. He genuinely loved the reaction. The more baffled or thrown off you were, the more he enjoyed it. I could almost hear his laugh in my head, that infectious, half-mischievous, half-innocent laugh that he was known for. He'd probably been waiting for me to put two and two together for years. And here we were, over a decade later, finally getting the punchline. It was such a perfect embodiment of his personality. Ryan was the kind of person who lived for moments like that. He was unpredictable in the best way. You could never be entirely sure what was going to happen next when you were around him, and that was part of the magic. He brought an energy into the room that made everything feel like an adventure. Even the smallest, most mundane events could turn into something wild when he was involved. A trip to the store for snacks could somehow lead to an impromptu road trip to the next town over, just because he got a random idea in his head. That was the essence of who he was, and the crawfish prank was just one tiny piece of the puzzle. It was a microcosm of all the things that made him such an unforgettable person. As I sat there beneath the oak tree, surrounded by people who had loved him just as much as I had, I couldn't help but smile. I pictured him sneaking around in the dark with a bucket full of crawfish, laughing to himself as he imagined the look on my family's faces the next morning. It was so absurd, but it was so him. In that moment, it felt like he was still with us, still pulling pranks from the other side. There's something comforting in that, I think. The idea that even though someone is gone, they leave pieces of themselves behind in the form of memories, moments, and yes, pranks. Ryan had always been larger than life, and even in death, he managed to leave his mark in the most unexpected ways. He had given me one last laugh, one last mystery to solve, and it was the perfect parting gift. After the memorial, I found myself thinking about him more and more, not in the way that made me sad. There's this tendency when someone dies to focus on the loss, the empty space they leave behind. But the more I thought about Ryan, the more I realized that he wasn't just gone. He was still here in a way, in the stories we told, in the memories we shared, and in the laughs we had over things like the crawfish prank. It's funny how life has a way of revealing its little mysteries when you least expect it. I had spent so many years wondering about those crawfish, thinking it was just one of those random, inexplicable things that happen sometimes. But now, with the truth finally out in the open, I realized it had been part of a much bigger story. A story about friendship, about growing up, about the joy of doing something just because it makes you laugh. Looking back, I can't help but smile. Sure, it was a prank that left us scratching our heads for years, but it was also a reminder of who Ryan was. Unpredictable, full of life, always up to something. The kind of person who could make you laugh, even when you didn't want to. The kind of person who could turn a normal summer day into a memory you'd carry with you for the rest of your life. I thought about telling the rest of the group at the memorial. After all, they would have appreciated the humor, but something about it felt like it was just for me. Final connection between Ryan. I could almost picture him shaking his head, telling me to keep the joke going a little longer. So I didn't say anything. I just smiled, grateful for the gift of that memory, the way it had come full circle in such a beautiful, unexpected way. When I got home that night, I told my dad about it. He didn't believe me at first. He'd spent so long thinking the crawfish incident was some neighborhood kids do, that the idea of Ryan being behind it was too far-fetched. But after I recounted Claire's story, the pieces started to fall into place for him too. He shook his head, laughing softly. Of course it was Ryan, he said. It always comes back to him, doesn't it? And he was right. It did. Ryan had this way of leaving a trail of stories in his wake, like breadcrumbs leading back to who he was. Some people leave legacies in the form of careers, accomplishments, or material things. Ryan left us with laughter and memories that never seemed to fade. As the weeks went by, I found myself reflecting on the memorial and how it had played out exactly the way it needed to. We had laughed, cried, and shared stories, not just of his illness or the sadness of his passing, but of his life, his wild, eccentric, beautiful life. And in that, there was something healing. I think in the end, that's what Ryan would have wanted. Not a long, drawn-out mourning period or a solemn tribute, just a group of friends sitting under an old oak tree, laughing about the time he filled someone's pool with crawfish. It's strange how one small memory can carry so much weight. That crawfish prank had been a mystery for so long, but now it had turned into something more. A reminder that even after someone is gone, they're never really gone. They live on in the moments we carry with us, the laughter that echoes through the years, and the strange, absurd mysteries that eventually find their answers. Ryan's final joke wasn't just a prank. It was a reminder to keep living, to keep laughing, and to never take life too seriously. And for that, I'll always be grateful.